Out of all the regions and cultures on the planet, it's hard to think of two that are more different than East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore it will probably come as a huge surprise to Westerners that the region of Sub-Saharan Africa was actually visited by the Chinese before the Europeans, although the Europeans, of course, had a presence in North Africa since antiquity. The first Portuguese explorers reached the mainland of West Africa in the year 1444, kicking off the age of European exploration and colonialism. But while the West was fighting amongst themselves, in the East, a new power had already started their age of exploration. The Yuan dynasty in the Far East was actually the last remnants of the Mongol Empire in China and lasted for less than a century before being overthrown and replaced by the Ming dynasty established by ethnic Han Chinese in 1368. The Ming dynasty today is largely recognized as the hallmark of Chinese innovation, construction, and exploration, as can be seen in the great Chinese explorer Zheng He, who led many expeditions across the planet. And although some of his accomplishments were greatly embellished, it's rather intriguing to think that Zheng He's fleet explored many areas of the Indian Ocean, including parts of Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the eastern coast of Sub-Saharan Africa. Zheng He, who was a part of the small Muslim minority in China known as the Hui, was on his way to visit the Islamic city of Mecca in 1418 and ended up landing on the Horn of Africa in the modern country of Somalia and actually traveled a bit further south to the city of Mombasa, which at the time was a modest port with heavy Swahili and Arab influence. The Chinese explorers didn't stay long though and decided to not explore further south, traveling north to the Middle East. However, out of the fleet of 317 ships that accompanied Zheng, one had gone off course to further explore the African mainland. These Chinese explorers ended up landing on Pate Island in modern Kenya, a relatively small island that only had a small fishing village at the time, and the Chinese explorers had traded and mingled with the local inhabitants of the island, most likely a Bantu Swahili-speaking people. The explorers, however, would end up having to call Pate Island their home and final resting place after their ship hit a reef off the shore, shipwrecking them there permanently. The explorers, who were 100% male, had not brought any women with them and recognized that no rescue was coming and that they would never see their families again, and after a short time had taken for themselves native wives and actually settled quite comfortably onto their new island home. The majority of the Chinese were either Buddhist or followed traditional Chinese religions, although they unanimously converted to Islam in order to marry into the natives, who were entirely Muslim, and almost all aspects of their former Eastern religions were lost in the next generation, although Chinese surnames were usually retained, such as Wei and Famao, which can still be found on the island to this day. Other factors, such as their language and culture, were eventually lost over time as well. Although there are no estimates to how many Kenyans today have partial ancestry from these Chinese explorers, we do know that Zheng He's 317 ships contained a total of 28,000 men, meaning that each ship contained a total of anywhere from 50 to 100 crew, although the number that landed on Pate was probably on the lower side at around 20. So the Chinese genes would have been greatly dispersed throughout the generations, seeing how there were no full-blooded Chinese left on Pate after the last of the explorers had passed away, and the Afro-Chinese descendants did not exactly form their own community or ethnic identity, opting instead to assimilate with the local Swahili people. Skeptics prompted further investigation from politicians and historians, including the People's Republic of China, who funded archaeologists on Pate in 2010, who excavated tombs on the island that matched Chinese graves from the Ming Dynasty 600 years ago, along with finding many other Chinese artifacts such as the 15th century Ming currency, seemingly confirming the tale. The Chinese descendants were completely absorbed into the community of Pate Island, and there are today only a handful of people on Pate that have any notable traces of Chinese features, seeing how even if locals did have Chinese DNA, it would be at rates of only 1 to 2% after hundreds of years of admixture. Nevertheless, there are still a few people on Pate Island with distinct Chinese features, such as the epicanthic eye fold, and the PRC government has been heavily invested in the region recently, giving scholarships to study in China for those they believe to be of paternal Han Chinese origin. although Africa would not be visited again by East Asian powers in any major capacity until the European colonial period about 300 years later. The pattern of African and Asian relations did not end at the settling of Pate by Chinese explorers. On a darker note, in the 1970s, around 1,000 Japanese miners had temporarily settled in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, then known as Zaire, in the southernmost region known as the Katanga province. The men were middle-aged and did not bring their wives with them, and had frequent relations with native Congolese women, and since safe sex wasn't really a thing back then, hundreds of children were born to these mothers. However, a shocking number of them ended up dying shortly after birth. Investigations had revealed that the Japanese fathers had poisoned their own infant children as not to bring shame onto themselves and their families, seeing how most of them already had wives and families back in Japan. The group of mixed Congolese Japanese origin today numbers somewhere in the low hundreds, although they have not yet formed their own identity, opting instead to marry with other native African peoples. There are countless other stories such as this throughout the European colonial period of Africa, as well as in the postmodern period as well, and many stories are rather fascinating and some incredibly morbid, which I've included in the description below for you to read about. One of the most interesting aspects of Sub-Saharan African and East Asian relations has been the increasing amount of attention, money, and manpower the PRC and other East Asian countries have invested into the African continent. The numbers of Chinese in the continent of Africa has virtually exploded in the past few decades, reaching 1 million people in 2010, and today it's estimated that there are at least 1.4 million people of ethnic Chinese descent in the Dark Continent, and possibly much more when taking illegal immigration and undocumented immigrants into account, with the largest communities being in South Africa, Angola, Ghana, and East Africa, as we touched on in our last video. It's estimated that the Chinese population will greatly increase in the future, seeing how the government has invested so much in the way of construction projects, mining operations, and offshore oil rigs, although very recently, as in the year 2017, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have been hit with waves of anti-Chinese violence, similar to the sentiments that overtook Southeast Asia in the 1970s to 90s, and many have decided to return home rather than settling there. South Africa currently contains the largest number of people of ethnic Chinese origin at 400,000 people, many of which had already been in the country for over a century, being among the first indentured workers to be exported to the territory from the British-owned Hong Kong or Singapore. Off the mainland of Africa, the small island nation of Mauritius has the highest proportion of those of Chinese descent, with those that are of unmixed Chinese descent being around 2% of the population, although this is expanded to at least 6% when those with at least some Chinese ancestry are included. The country of Angola has the largest proportion of Chinese on the mainland of the continent at around 1.4%, which might not sound like a lot, but is truly unprecedented and quite incredible for any African country. Even though most Chinese migrants to Africa are not permanent residents, they're largely seen as a boost to the local economies, although many Africans may see them as foreigners that are only there to exploit and steal from the native populace. One of the primary factors in this period of global Chinese expansionism is the one-child policy, which has greatly impacted the family and gender dynamics in the PRC, causing a gender imbalance of 6 males per 5 females in China, meaning that 1 out of every 6 Chinese men, or around 16%, will never be married. That is, when not taking divorce or the importation of foreign brides into account. This has led to huge numbers of Chinese heading overseas, and while most might take the familiar route of Southeast Asia or the United States, some are choosing to go on the road less traveled. And although many Africans are welcoming the new wave of Chinese investors, others are very scrupulous or outright hostile, which can be expected with any major change that hits a society. Either way, China's renewed interest in the African continent has certainly seemed to peak in recent years, which to me is quite a fascinating prospect considering how East Asians and Sub-Saharan Africans are pretty much some of the most divergent groups of people on the planet when it comes to genetics, culture, and appearance. And keep in mind, I'm not celebrating the mass importation of a foreign ethnic group into the continent of Africa, but it's exciting and rather heartwarming to see two groups that have historically had very poor relations here in the United States cooperating on the other side of the planet. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on the Chinese population of Africa, including the ships that had drifted from Zheng He's fleet and shipwrecked on Pate Island. Let me know, especially if you're from the continent of Africa. I'm curious as to whether the Chinese are seen as mutual benefactors or more as neo-colonial opportunists. As always, thanks for watching, everyone. It's been Mason, and I'll see you next time.